Laudate Deum, Praise God, is the title of the Apostolic Exhortation published today at the end of the season of creation, and its subtitle on the climate crisis is a clear reference to the situation in which we find ourselves. Stay tuned for the next hour. We will address the Pope's message in all its depth. Si deseas participar en castellano, por favor, en el chat encontrarás el enlace a Zoom. Se vorrei partecipare in italiano, trovate il link alla chat. My colleague Lin Lin, Advocacy Director at LSM, will moderate this online dialogue. Let's go!
Happy Feast of St. Francis. As we conclude the season of creation, I am grateful for everyone who has joined us in celebrating our common home. A warm welcome from participants from all around the world. I'm joining you from South Africa. Do share your location in the chat and any questions and comments that you may have during this dialogue. Today is a special day when we welcome Laudate Deum. It's an apostolic exhortation from the Holy Father Francis to all people of goodwill on the climate crisis, not on climate change. The Holy Father reminds us that this is not a climate change. It's unfortunate that some people call it climate change, which could either be a positive or negative phenomenon. The Holy Father emphasizes that this is a crisis, which is extremely negative and is an emergency. The Holy Father has a big worry. 8 years, he published the encyclical letter Laudato Si. And today, he has published another exhortation. He says, when I wanted to share with you all my brothers and sisters of our suffering planet, my heartfelt concerns about the care of our common home. But yet, with the passage of time, I have realized that our responses have not been adequate. While the world in which we live in is collapsing and may be nearing breaking points. We begin this exhortation with a message from Cardinal Treni, who is the prefect of the Vatican Dicastery for Human Development, who unfortunately could not be here today to join us. He's participating in the Synod of Synodality, which commences today. Cardinal Treni.
Dear friends, today, the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi, Pope Francis released his new exhortation, Laudate Deum, Praise God. It is an urgent appeal to all of us, believers of every kind, to join forces against the climate crisis. On the one hand, Laudato Deum neither repeats nor replaces anything in Laudato Si. So, what are the new developments in the 8 years since Laudato Si was published? First, Laudate Deum is focused very clearly, very sharply on the climate crisis. And it doesn't touch on many other related topics like biodiversity, pollution, water, and their social implications. That doesn't mean that they aren't important, but it doesn't try to talk about everything. Pope Francis is extremely worried about the dramatic urgency of the climate crisis and how all scientific indicators have now seriously deteriorated in the past 8 years. That is why the first chapter is an unprecedented deep dive into the latest climate science, with the solid scientific consensus about the role that, unfortunately, we humans are playing in provoking this great crisis. Laudate Deum is heavily focused on the drama of humanity's poor attempts to solve the crisis, mainly via diplomatic collaboration among the world's states and the world's state leaders. In fact, 3 out of the 6 chapters are focused on the theme of multilateralism, countries trying to cooperate, and the UN Climate Summit to be held in Dubai in late November this year. Pope Francis makes a strong appeal to keep working together in the urgently needed energy transition away from fossil fuels. So, my dear friends, please focus. The key question is, what can we, beginning with our leaders, do to overcome the most urgent climate crisis? God bless you, and let's work together.
We appreciate you, Cardinal Czerny, for that opening and context. Today, we are honored to be joined by esteemed personalities in the global fight against the climate crisis to discuss Laudate Deum. These representatives from various parts of the world will be sharing video messages with us and offering valuable insights and perspectives. They include Dr. Johan Rockström, Christina Figueres, Tepora Berman, Bill McKeevan, Ridima Pandey, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Brother Dan Horan, Reverend Fletcher. Please stay tuned for their contributions. The first chapter of Laudate Deum is quite a detailed overview of the climate science, including unprecedented citations of the IPCC. If you see the next slide, the Holy Father calls us. He's very clear that if global temperatures increase by 15 degrees, heat waves will be much more frequent and with greater intensity. If it should rise above 2 degrees, the ice caps of Greenland and a large part of Antarctica will melt completely. He states that we are now unable to halt the enormous damage we have caused. We barely have time to prevent even more tragic damage. The Holy Father is very careful to cite the IPCC, something which he hasn't done before. I welcome Dr. Johan Rockström, who is the director of the Potsdam Institute. Dr. Rockström, why is Pope Francis so worried about crossing the 1.5 degree threshold?
Yeah, thanks, Lindlin, and it's a great honor to be here at this launch of Laudate Deum. So let me just start by just making very clear that Pope Francis' conclusion that we have a climate crisis that even is a planetary emergency is supported by science. And Pope Francis' conclusion that we're making no progress and that this is taking us very close to unmanageable risks also has scientific support. Now, on your question on 1.5 degrees Celsius, to understand why 1.5 is a limit, you have to understand that during the entire human journey as a civilization on planet Earth, we've never exceeded 14 degrees Celsius plus minus 0.5. So the maximum temperature range has been plus 0.5 during the last 12,000 years since we left the last ice age. So 1.2 degrees Celsius, where we are today, is already a factor 2 magnitude beyond the warmest temperature on Earth since we left the last ice age. In fact, the IPCC concludes that we have the warmest temperature on Earth this year over the past 100,000 years. This is why one piece of evidence that we have to consider. But on your direct question on 1.5, well, it's unfortunately wrongly portrayed as a target or a goal or something we can negotiate with. But science is today very clear. The IPCC puts 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius as a high-risk range for triggering irreversible change. Our latest science has mapped 16 climate tipping element systems, the large biophysical systems that regulates the stability of the climate system and that have tipping points. 5 of these are likely to cross the tipping points at 1.5. These are the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, all the tropical coral reef systems, livelihoods to over 300 million people, abrupt thawing of permafrost in the Arctic, and loss of the Barents Sea ice. Just the 2 ice sheets, which Pope Francis also emphasizes in Laudate Deum, holds 10-meter sea level rise. These are unacceptable and potentially unmanageable impacts for humanity. So therefore, 1.5 degrees Celsius is a really serious number, and we have to do everything we can to hold it.
Dr. Rocksham, indeed, we need to do everything we can to hold it. But the Holy Father emphasizes that there are small pockets of climate denials. He says very clearly in Laudate Deum 14, I feel obliged to make these clarifications, which may appear obvious because of certain dismissive and scarcely reasonable opinions that I encounter, even within the Catholic Church. Why do we still have small pockets of climate denials in northern countries all over the world and even within the church?
Well, just like Pope Francis, I and my colleagues face climate denialism all the time, even though, just like Pope Francis, I also agree that it's marginal. And actually, personally, I think it's something that we do not have to be concerned with and should not engage much in debate with, because the scientific evidence is so overwhelming and we have unequivocal support that we are causing global warming from all the empirical observations and all the analytics that we have. But let me also share with you that, we have in society always people who are questioning facts and truth. We have those who are questioning vaccines, those who are against all forms of scientific inquiry, xenophobia, anti-immigration. We always have a portion of society that are questioning the fundamental basis of truth and dignity and direction, even for democracy. I think we don't have time to wait for these marginal and call them maverick positions in society. I'm happy to engage with them, but I think we have to move forward very decisively based on the scientific facts we have. And let me just say a final hypothesis that I have, which is that one reason why we're seeing climate denialism rising the recent just few years, I think, is because we are about to win, meaning that the transition towards a safe and dignified, sustainable and healthy future for humanity is something that is happening. We are on the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel-driven world economy. This is getting serious. The transition towards a sustainable future is really happening as we speak. It's going much too slowly, but it's happening. The writing is on the wall. There's no turning back. And that's, of course, as we know from history, one reason why you get particularly hard reactions from those who gain from, or those with vested interests from status quo. So it's not so surprising that we get a bit more, let's say, higher volume from climate denialism at a point where the zero carbon solutions are actually proving to be much more competitive, much more attractive, and actually possible to scale, and that they are scaling. So I think we should take the noise from climate denialism today not as a very important threat, but rather use it as a point of raising our pace even further in the pathway towards a safe future for humanity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johan. Indeed, we do not have time to focus on them. We need to look forward on the future, on getting a common home which is safe and livable for all. I would like to share a video message from Cristina Figueres. She is the former UN chief of the UNFCCC, and she was the architect behind the Paris Agreement of 2015. Cristina?
Hello, friends. I am Cristiana Figueres, and I would like to warmly welcome the Holy Father's new exhortation, Laudate Deum, in which he reminds us of our responsibility to use the three human languages he has identified for us, head, heart, and hands, to protect nature and to protect the most vulnerable of our societies, to regenerate ourselves and to ensure we are good stewards of our planetary home for the well-being of all present, but especially of all future generations.
We'll hear from Tipora Berman from Stand Earth, but also the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. She will be speaking to us about multilateralism and COP. The Holy Father states that indeed international negotiations cannot make significant progress due to countries which place their national interests above the global common good. And he says, despite the many negotiations and agreements, global emissions continue to increase. But before I bring in Tepola, I would like us to have a video message from Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bill McKibben here. The release of Laudato Si was one of the most important landmarks in the ongoing climate fight, a fight that I've been a part of since its start. It helped galvanize attention around the universality of this crisis, about the fact that it incorporates all the other problems that the world faces within it. And that, and the work of other faith and spiritual leaders around the world, may be the best chance we have at actually getting a hold of things. Yes, the engineers have done their job. Yes, the scientists have done their job. But it's high time for the human heart to do its job. And that's what we need this leadership for so badly.
That appeal. Tepola, Laudato Si was a groundbreaking document before Paris. Considering Laudato Deum is coming up now, just before COP28, what is the significance of COP28 in the global efforts to combat the climate crisis? The Holy Father, Pope Francis, does say that we can keep hoping that COP28 will allow for a decisive acceleration of the energy transition. He also says that one can only hope for binding forms of energy transitions that meet three conditions: that they be efficient, obligatory, and readily monitored. He states a new process marked by these three requirements will be drastic, intense, and needs the commitment of all. Why do we have to look forward so much to COP28 in the fight against the climate crisis?
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here on this incredibly important day. Look, I think what's exciting about the Holy Father's statement and this moment that we're in the run-up to COP28 is that we're seeing a seismic shift in the way that we talk about climate change that is long overdue. We have had 27 COPs that have not talked about fossil fuels. The industry has been successful in making their products invisible. The Paris Agreement didn't even include the words fossil fuels or oil, gas, or coal. And the fact is that our governments have been negotiating emissions targets, while behind our backs, fossil fuel production has been continuing to rise. And that locks in the future emissions and is one of the reasons that we continue to miss our targets globally. But last month at the UN Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit, the United Nations recognized for the first time since international climate negotiations began 30 years ago that oil, gas, and coal are the root cause of the climate crisis and must be phased out. And today, the Holy Father pointed out that gas and oil companies are planning new projects that he pointed out the influence of the fossil fuel industry. This shift is seminal. And at the summit last week, Tuvalu called for an official mandate to begin negotiating a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which was supported by Lydie Napsil, the civil society delegate from the Third World Network. Just 2 days later, Antigua and Barbuda and Timor-Leste joined the bloc of 6 nations, including Tuvalu, that's called for a fossil fuel treaty. And now indigenous nations from across the Amazon are joining faith leaders from around the world, calling for a fossil fuel treaty. This is the result of citizens from around the world calling out the hypocrisy in the negotiations, that countries would continue to, as the Holy Father said, look at their own interests, all want to be the last barrel sold and continue to expand fossil fuel products, even when we know that we need to stop expansion. But I think we're seeing a huge shift in the way this is talked about, and that's critical for COP28. It means COP28 will be, I think, one of the most significant meetings as nations bring the call for negotiating a fossil fuel treaty to the UNFCCC, which could create one of the missing pieces in helping us to meet Paris goals. But also within the COP28 process, there are ways that we can start to align fossil fuel production with clear commitments to stop expanding new projects. So we focus on building the world that we want, on building the world that is safe. So, I think regardless of the negotiation outcomes at COP28, these UNFCCC meetings provide a global platform to amplify key demands and a place where all the world leaders are focusing on climate change. And this year, they're also going to be focusing on the fact that fossil fuel production is not being constrained. And in fact, we're on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal than we can ever burn under a 1.5 degree scenario. And that truth is now being inserted into the climate conversation globally. And I think that's a game changer.
Thank you so much, Sephora, for actually bringing this truth around fossil fuels within the climate negotiations. Regarding Laudato Deum, in paragraph 50, the Holy Father is very clear. Pope Francis states fossil fuels still provide 80% of the world's energy, and they continue to grow. They continue to grow even as we speak. And, gas and oil companies, as you rightly said, are planning new projects, even though we're calling, for the end of these projects with the aim of just, further increasing their expansion. The Holy Father is very clear. In Laudato Deum 55, he says the necessary transitions towards clean energy sources, such as wind and solar energy, and the abandonment of fossil fuel is not progressing at the necessary speed. What can our audience do? What can citizens around the world do to accelerate this just transition away from fossil fuels?
Citizens around the world need to face the climate emergency. We need to start thinking of ourselves not just as consumers. It's not just about what we buy, though of course our lifestyles are important. We need to be thinking of ourselves as voters, as citizens. And we need to remember that our elected officials work for us. And that means organizing. That means picking up your placards, your petitions, knocking on doors. It means engaging in calling on decision makers to act. At a national level, that means ensuring that our governments are not approving new projects like the UK approving Rosebank or Biden approving Willow. The IEA net zero report that came out last week was very clear. We can't afford any new fossil fuel products. We need our financial, our political capital, and our intellectual capital to be going towards clean energy. And so that means that people around the world need to join together. And that's why we've created the Fossil Fuel Treaty, because together we're so much stronger than apart. And parliamentarians from around the world are joining the call, faith leaders, health leaders, now 8 national governments in over 100 cities. So I urge people around the world to make the idea of a fossil fuel treaty, this big, bold new idea, their own, that to campaign for it in their homes, to join together with people around the world saying, it's not just about the new damaging oil drilling in the heart of the Amazon. It's not just about Biden's Willow Project. This is about ensuring that we are all safe. And despair at this moment is a privilege. We all have to act. And I guess I would just end on a more, in some ways, deeply personal step that people can take. Open our hearts to the impacts of climate change. It's hard. It's hard to stare at the impacts and to grieve. I know that because my country is still on fire. After 4 months, we are still experiencing wildfires across Canada. Millions and millions of hectares of forest has been destroyed, and tens of thousands of people have been displaced, and that's hard. But hope Hope today is our responsibility. Hope is a moral choice, and we need to create it every day with our actions. And so organize, vote for leaders who are not expanding fossil fuels and who are acting on climate change. And make sure that your decision makers know that you care and that you'll support them when they make the hard choices.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for that very distinct call to action there. And you mentioned looking at our hearts. And the scripture says, where our hearts are, so is where your treasure is. There is a massive divestment campaign from the fossil fuel industry. And we appeal to everyone to actually examine where your heart is. That is where your treasure is. So if you still have money in the fossil fuel industry, you need to be moving it out, because your money in the fossil fuel industry is actually supporting that industry. Thank you so much, Deborah, for the call to action. Last year, Pope Francis was featured in the letter, an incredible documentary about Laudate Si. I encourage all of you to watch it and take action based on its insight. It's an incredible documentary about Laudate Si. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined all the way from India. Ridhima Pandey is one of the protagonists in the documentary. And Ridhima, thank you so much. Your activism since the age of 9 in your country is noticeable. You were involved in a lawsuit against your government for its climate inaction, and you were part of bigger initiatives on climate activism. So, just given your activism in India and frequent COP disappointments, Tepoa just mentioned that there's not been the discussion around fossil fuel. And Pope Francis does say in Laudate Deum 13 that regrettably the climate crisis is not exactly a matter that interests great economic superpowers, whose concern at this time is great profits. Yeah. And just given this reality, how do you given this reality, how do you view Laudate Deum?
Thank you so much for having me here. I mean, being inspired by Laudate Si, being part of the letter, and now being here on this very special day, I think it really means a lot to me as an activist. And the very first thing when I read about Laudate Deum was, even that emphasis on the word crisis, I think is really important, because just, having these different words, climate change, and regarding it as a crisis is very important for the people, because we, even until now, just regard this as something which doesn't really need that much attention. And I think that, I believe that we cannot really undo what's been done already, but Laudate Deum gives us this inspiration that though, we cannot undo what's been done already, but we can still say what's left with us. And I believe even Laudate Si and then Laudate Deum is just this huge kind of inspiration for everybody who wants to take action. And then at the same time, it gives you this alarming overview that this crisis is impacting a lot of people, and it's not just something that Pope Francis is saying or it's what he feels, but it is the reality of the world. The science supports it, we support it as an activist, and people have to believe and people have to realize that it's now that they have to take action, or else we cannot really see a future where humanity will be able to survive. So, I believe that it is really important for all of us to start taking action and start respecting this biodiversity which makes us survive on this planet.
Thank you so much, Ridhima. And after meeting the Holy Father and acknowledging his call for faith-based unity and considering the looming climate hazards, what are your hopes and plans after receiving Laudate Deum. And I just want to note what the Holy Father says about activism and civil society, because he calls on us to initiate our activism as a response. He says clearly in Laudate Deum 37, civil society with its organizations is capable of creating effective dynamics that the United Nations cannot. He also states that the demands that rise up from below throughout the world, including yourselves, where activists from very different countries help and support one another, can end up pressuring the sources of power. And he notes further, once and for all, let us put an end to the irresponsible direction that would present this issue as something purely ecological, green, romantic, frequently subject to the ridicule of economic interests. So activism has been ridiculed, but the Holy Father is calling us to actually step up our activism. He's saying that we should go on. So just my last question to you, after meeting the Holy Father and realizing his call and considering all the hazards that we are facing today, what are your hopes and plans that we can support you in after receiving Laudate Deum today?
I mean, firstly, I would like to thank Holy Father for giving this recognition to the activists. Finally, I have seen somebody, who has been appreciating activists a lot, because, I mean, as an activist, we are very used to or very ready to receive backlash and complaints about us being, so persistent that we need change, and, us being so, like, I don't know if we will call it stubborn, but nagging around the governments, about change, about taking climate crisis seriously, and trying our best to make the people realize the mistake they've been making. So I believe this appreciation, and even just writing about that, how activists are driving a change, and how important and how impactful our actions has been, really means a lot to us. And I believe what I can take from Laudate Deum is that, the very first thing is that science is really important. And we have to understand that climate crisis has already made a huge damage to people living all around the world. Specifically, being from a country like India, I have seen such a huge destruction in my country. Just this year, we saw one part of the world is underwater, where the other part is, it's burning. And all this just makes us realize that this is climate change. And right now we are facing things in this way, so we cannot really imagine how the future.
I think we unfortunately lost Redeemer there. Redeemer, we're so grateful and humbled by your activism. I've personally followed your case and studied your case, and it's really an inspiration what you do. At LSM, we are delighted to collaborate with different faith groups combating the climate crisis. We do collaborate with Green Faith. Here is what Reverend Fletcher Harper from Green Faith had to say about Laudate Deum.
I'm Fletcher Harper with Green Faith, an international multi-faith climate justice organization. 7 years ago, when Pope Francis released Laudato Si', it helped create the moral, cultural momentum that resulted in the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, years later, the situation remains urgent. Climate impacts are increasing around the world. As always, those who have done the least to contribute to the problem suffer its worst effects. And that's why this new document from Pope Francis is so important. The need is clear: an immediate end to new fossil fuel development, an equitable phase out of existing production, substantial commitments to a just transition for impacted workers and communities, payments by historic climate polluters to loss and damages suffered by climate vulnerable nations. The need is clear, the moral logic is indisputable, and again, Pope Francis has made an important contribution, calling us all to put our beliefs into action for the earth.
It's always a pleasure to collaborate with you. Joining up next is Brother Dan Horan. He's a Franciscan friar and professor of philosophy and theology at St. Mary's College in the US. Thank you, Brother Dan, for joining us.
Thank you, Lin. Good to be with you.
Just bringing up the next slide. We've been talking about technical things for a while. Yeah, but Pope Francis does talk about the technocratic paradigm. He says the notion of human being with no limits, whose abilities and possibilities can be infinitely expanded thanks to technology. And he calls us to let us stop thinking then of human being as autonomous, omnipotent, and limitless. As a Franciscan, could you share why the life of St. Francis, cited in the very beginning of Laudate Deum, is so important in the journey ahead?
I'd be happy to. In fact, this is such a fortuitous day to talk about the life of St. Francis and the influence of St. Francis. Happy feast day to all of our friends and siblings around the globe on the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi. I read a comment from an international news outlet earlier today about the document that described it in this kind of technocratic way you were mentioning, Lin, that this reads at times like a policy paper and maybe not as poetic or spiritual as Laudato Si in 2015. And I think one of the things that we must keep in mind is what Pope Francis invites us from the outset to do, and others on this really humbling panel have already encouraged as well, which is to see Laudate Deum as an addendum to Laudato Si, so that the spiritual influence is present in this text as much as in Laudato Si. One of the things that's so significant about the life of St. Francis is that maybe more than any person after Christ himself, Francis of Assisi intuited and recognized his inherent relationship with all of creation, his membership in God's family of creation, this broader community of creation, which is why he was able so intuitively to call all creatures, human and otherwise, his siblings, his sister and brother, and of course, our sister Mother Earth. And so I think one of the things that's important, and I even wrote about this a little bit today in my column in National Catholic Reporter, is that Francis of Assisi understood his place as part of an interdependent, interrelated, and connected community. And I think, as Pope Francis says in this document, and Lin, you quoted from one part that I'd like to highlight even further, which is in paragraph 68, where the Holy Father says, let us stop thinking then of human beings as autonomous, omnipotent, and limitless. And then he says, and begin to think of ourselves differently in a humbler, more fruitful way, that we are interconnected, that our obligations, our responsibilities to the rest of creation arise out of our being a part of the same family and not being above and against, over and above as those bearing dominance or even stewardship, that we're actually brothers and sisters and siblings to all.
Thank you so much, Brother Dan. You know, when you read Laudato Deum, and I've been reading it since it came out, Pope Francis mentions that I cannot fail in this regard to remind the Catholic faithful of the motivations born of their faith, which sheds light on our relationships to others and with creation as a whole. And he says the world sings an infinite love. How can we fail to care for it? This is really calling to our deep spirituality. And we do not, at this moment, sing a love song back to the world. How do we sing a love song to our common home?
Well, I can't help but again think of St. Francis of Assisi, that great inspiration for our Holy Father, that St. Francis in his Canticle of the Creatures, from which both the title of this exhortation and the encyclical Laudato Si come, Francis of Assisi is actually acknowledging that all aspects of this family of creation are singing the praises of God. The sun by its rays and light, the moon by its ambiance, our sister Mother Earth by providing a home and all the greenery we benefit from. The one thing he says, though, is that we human beings are not worthy to utter God's name. He acknowledges that we're the ones out of tune. If we think of a kind of large chorus or a symphony of creation, all these other creatures, all these other elements of the cosmos are in tune with one another. They know the music, they've rehearsed it, they're doing it in response to God's conducting, as it were. But we are out of tune. We're playing a different song, and that song is a song of anthropocentrism. So how do we sing praise to God? I think first and foremost, we need to get back in tune with the rest of creation. We need to be attentive to what the family of creation is calling us to and what the Holy Father is reminding us of here, that it's not just all about us, that human dignity is important, but as he says in paragraph 67, we have to recognize, in other words, that human life is incomprehensible and unsustainable without other creatures. We don't go it alone. And we need to get back in tune with the rest of that chorus. Only then will we sing that praise back to God.
Indeed, Brother Dan, we just finished season of creation, but we didn't actually finish it. It's a continuous journey. We are called to continually sing this love song back to creation. It's a reconciliation with creation. That's an endless journey that we have to do. Thank you so much, Brother Dan, and please don't leave us because I see there are a lot of questions coming in the chat to you. Next up, I would like to introduce Justin Welby, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury and the head of the Global Anglican Church, who shares a message with us on Laudate Deum.
My greetings to you. Last week, at the end of September, at the UN General Assembly, the Secretary General talked of a world of its hinges, with the great fractures, climate crisis, of war, leading from climate crisis and contributing to climate crisis, of suffering and poverty. Laudate Deum comes at a moment of unique challenge for the whole of humanity. As in the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, God lays before us a choice and says, choose life. Laudate Deum chooses life. It is a word from the churches to the people of God around the world and to every human being, from the mouth of the Pope, calling for a united humanity that will serve our suffering creation, will heal the wounds of our world, and for a church that will speak of hope, transformation, and a future.
We have received loads of questions from our audience, and I'll be referring them back to you. First up, Tepora, there is a question from the audience asking, what is the Fossil Fuel Treaty? What is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty? Please, can you share with us in some short words what it is?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. The Fossil Fuel Treaty is a proposal for a new international cooperation and global governance mechanisms to constrain the production of fossil fuels in line with our climate goals. It's one of the missing pieces or frameworks that we need to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So it has three pillars, roughly designed on the idea of nuclear nonproliferation. First, we have to manage the stockpile. We have to stop making the problem bigger. So agreements around stopping expansion. The second pillar is around managing the wind down. We need international cooperation on who gets to produce what fossil fuels and how much, so we don't continue blowing past the global carbon budget. And then the third pillar is around global just transition. How do we ensure that we have cooperation on the building the world that we want in a way that is fast, in a way that is fair, with equity at its core, and in a way that is financed? Because there are some countries right now, for example, in the global south, Ecuador, who are drilling for new oil in the heart of the Amazon just to feed their debt. We're going to need international cooperation to ensure that we make the transition and we stop making the problem bigger. Some say that it's too new, it's too bold an idea. But the fact is we can't afford more of the same. And when we studied 5 other global treaties that the world has created, from the point that nation states start proposing a new framework, it can be as quick as 2 years to achieve negotiations on a new treaty. And of course, it's unlikely that some of the big producers, like the US, who's responsible right now for the majority of expansion of oil and gas planned in the next decade, would join a treaty. But if you look at other treaties, you see that even the countries that didn't join started to constrain the stockpiling of landmines, of nuclear weapons, because the proposal for a new treaty shifted the norm of what was acceptable in foreign policy. And I think that's what we're seeing with the support around the world for a new fossil fuel treaty, is it's making it unacceptable for countries to continue to say they're climate leaders while expanding new fossil fuel projects.
Very true, Tipper. And large parts of the church is actually signing up to the Fossil Fuel Treaty, including parts of the Catholic Church, Cardinal Czerny, and also in Latin America. And we're so grateful for this advancement. Dr. Johan, I'd like to come back to you. Despite, what you said, that we should ignore these climate deniers, I think this is a question that is really disturbing our audience, because I think they're faced with this every day. There's a question that says, how to involve those who still deny climate change or do not want to be involved? Is it by increasing awareness between climate change and the health conditions of their families?
Yeah, no, I understand that it may be perceived as a bit, let's say, challenging to ignore. I'm just saying this basically from what the science is telling us, which is that we have the emergency tells us that it's urgent with speed. But let me give you there are two paths to deal with denialism, which of course I have to deal with every day as well, which I think can be and is very successful. The first one is to recognize that we've been making fundamental mistakes over the past 50 years in how we have been communicating and dealing with environmental problems in the environmental community, but also among the scientific community, because we have portrayed it as environmental problems that you have to have awareness to solve, and you have to have willingness to pay to be willing to step up to resolve them. So it's all been different levels of sacrifice to handle the dichotomy between human development or societal development and environmental problems. We now know that we are not facing environmental problems. We're facing challenges of human dignity, human well-being, health, security, peace, and economic stability. So the climate crisis is not an environmental crisis, it's an existential crisis for the stability of societies. This is one of the biggest failures we have. Just take one example. We have so much scientific evidence today that already at 2 degrees Celsius, we will have 2 billion people living in regions that have crossed a health threshold, which makes basically the regions a health threat, potentially even life-threatening, just in terms of the heat levels, temperature levels. This is a recipe for social instability, migration, displacement, and conflict. Well, you tend to see a very close correlation between those that are denialists, but also those that are anti-immigration. But if you really want to stop immigration and protect your freedom and your independence in the environments where you live, you want to solve the climate crisis, because that's the only way to create enabling conditions for life in every part of planet Earth. So I think we simply need to change the story towards security, health, and stability of societies. That's one. The second one is even more straightforward. We don't have to talk about willingness to pay or step of sacrifice, because the journey towards a zero carbon sustainable future is increasingly proven to be smarter, cheaper, and much more modern, and therefore more attractive. It's quite interesting. Just today, this morning, South Africa showing that they're having exponential rise in solar voltaics. Why? Because Eskom is not able to provide coal-driven electricity to the citizens in South Africa, and it's much cheaper to buy simple, independent solar voltaics, which you, after 6-7 years, you have a full cost recovery, you earn money from it, you get clean electricity, and you're independent, and you simply outcompete Eskom and the coal-driven electricity. And I think these are the two pieces that we have to work much, much more actively with. This is a security agenda, and it's a pathway to modernity. And I think that's a way also to. I don't think there's so much value in confronting denialism with scientific evidence, because you just get denialism back. It's better to just tell a completely different story.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johan. Indeed, living in South Africa, we are evidence that, coal is not the answer. Redeemer, I'd like to bring you up, and also Tepora. There's a question from the audience that says Pope Francis supports environmental groups who have been negatively portrayed as radicalized. Is it more time for civil disobedience? And especially looking at the youth activism, how do we support this?
If I take this ahead, I mean, I don't know how to explain this feeling of being, portrayed as someone, I mean, being portrayed so negatively when the thing that you're working on is something that is for the betterment of the entire world. But I believe that, it is important to support the work that the activists have been doing so far, not just giving them support morally, but also giving them this support of their actions, because activists all around the world have done some amazing campaigns and works and petitions, regarded to climate change, taking an example of the petition that we did at the United Nations, to protect the child rights of children all around the world. So activists around the world have been working tirelessly, to work with the government and to work against the destructive policies of the governments, to bring up a change so that the world and the humanity can sustain in a world which is better for everybody. And regardless of the matter of the fact that we as young people are not really responsible for this crisis, yet we are the ones trying our very best to solve the crisis, because at the very end we know that we are struggling right now, and I might possibly die in the near future because of climate crisis if nothing would be done. So I believe supporting the action that the young people have been taking so far is important, and then at the same time realizing that coming together and taking action is which can give us a certain point where we can say that yes, we have seen change. Because I've been working since 2017, and it's been really hard to drive people to believe climate crisis is an existential crisis. And now that people believe that working on this crisis is important, I believe coming together and taking action is really, really important.
Thank you so much, Redeemer, for really bringing that attention, that it's not about radicalization, it's actually about securing a right to life. It's a right to life. And Tepora, I'd like to bring you up because we've marched many times at these COPs, and it's being called some form of disobedience. How do we intensify the civil disobedience?
There are moments in history when our governments fail us, when vested interests have more of an influence on governments, that they're looking at, they're not acting in the public good. And throughout history, civil disobedience has been crucial in those moments to ensure civil rights, ensure women's rights, and now to ensure that our politicians cannot look away from the climate emergency. Everyone needs to do what they can and what they're safe and comfortable with. And for a lot of people around the world, civil disobedience is not an option because their lives are threatened. For some people, it is an option. And I think it's an incredibly important option for people to take if they can, because people need to see that you're willing to take actions that are commensurate with the scale of the problem, because the climate emergency is so normalized in our everyday life in some ways, and this is not a normal time, and it requires us to step out and take risks. I want to say one thing about supporting the youth climate activism as well, because I'm a mom, and it breaks my heart to see teenagers having to spend their time organizing and marching and not riding their bikes or pursuing the arts. And so I think, how do we support? We don't leave it up to them. No matter what your age, you can be marching, you can be organizing, and also fund them. I was really excited to see at Climate Week the announcement of the Youth Climate Justice Fund. a climate justice fund that's run by youth and for youth to make sure that they're supported in the work that they do. So I urge people to support them, and to remember that there's no right way to organize. We need to let 1,000 flowers bloom, and the most important thing is that every day we get up and we put on that hope cloak and we make a decision on what we're going to do that day in order to ensure that the climate crisis is at the forefront of decision makers' desks.
Thank you so much, Tipora. There's been questions in the chat about the activism of the church, the actions of the church. Rather than the questions that the church should also be reducing its footprints, and it is required for all Catholic priests and parishes around the world to review and support the writings of Pope Francis, warning us about this climate crisis. And if not, why? Why aren't we doing this? And how should we do this more as the church?
These are really important questions that unfortunately don't have always easy answers. Similar to the questions that have come from our viewers to Dr. Rockstrom about climate denialism, that unfortunately there are people in the church, including ministers in the church and lay leaders and the faithful altogether, who for whatever reason, maybe partnered with climate denialism, are not interested in receiving this magisterial teaching from the Holy Father. I think it's important for us to realize that though there is not necessarily in every diocese and in every parish and every region of the world an explicit sort of emphasis that all church leaders, ministers, and the faithful actively study and receive these texts, there really should be. This is the exercise of ordinary magisterium. Pope Francis in the encyclical Laudato Si in 2015 says very clearly in the introduction, this is part of our moral teaching. He lays out a genealogy of how this teaching fits in with the Catholic social teaching that is at the heart of our moral vision and action. And as he makes clear in Laudate Deum, this apostolic exhortation, though in the hierarchy of church teaching doesn't rise to the exact same level as Laudato Si, is an addendum, is a follow-up, is an addition to that magisterial teaching. And so this should be received. And I encourage all the folks viewing our conversation today to study this text and to encourage their faith communities to do likewise. I think that question about activism and reducing the church's carbon footprint is very important as well. I think it's also worthwhile in the spirit of ecclesiology to remember that two things. One, that the Church Universal isn't a top-down corporation. We're not a kind of monarchy or even a democracy where, the Holy Father tells the cardinals, who tell the bishops, who tell the priests, and so forth. But rather, we are a communion of communions. And in each corner of the church, each religious community, each parish, we have to look in a spirit of subsidiarity. What can we do at the local level to affect change, to make an impact? And so I'm thinking, for instance, of the Laudato Si Action Platform and the call for ecological economics. So do we at the local level divest ourselves of fossil fuel investments and the like? What can we do at the local level? As the Holy Father says toward the end of Laudate Deum in paragraph 70, he says, every little bit helps, and cultural change is how we get there. So I think that's what we need to do, and remember that we are the church, all the baptized.
Thank you so much, Brother Dan. One of the solutions that is not a solution is carbon capture and storage. And Pope Francis is very clear about this in Laudato Deum. And Dr. Rockstrom, I would like to invite you to just, bring clarity to this false solution. It is not a solution, and there are proponents of it. But Pope Francis is very clear that this is not a solution for our time.
Yeah, so this is a really important question because it's not as black or white as it's being a solution, not a solution. So if you look at the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it has two families of climate scenarios that can take us to a safe landing at 1.5 degrees Celsius. One of them is the so-called C1 scenarios. Those are the ones that we all, let's say, adopted, which is they take us directly to 1.5. They give us a very narrow window, and we actually conclude, it's not been published yet, but we conclude at the Potsdam Institute that the door is unfortunately shut to those C1 scenarios. It's too late. We've emitted too much. We're not making progress. It's not feasible. So the only remaining path we have are the so-called C2 scenarios. And these are the scenarios that have overshoot, which means that within 15 years, roughly, we are likely to pass through 1.5. But if we reduce emissions according to what the IPCC scenarios show is necessary, by cutting emissions by half every decade to a net zero world economy, to have basically zero fossil fuels, following the fossil fuel treaty that CEPRA has been laying out, by 2050, that would give us an overshoot of roughly 30 years with 0.1 to 0.3 degrees Celsius of warming beyond 1.5. Very dangerous, for sure, high degree of increased extreme events hitting communities across the entire world, potentially crossing tipping points, a very turbulent journey, but then we would be able to come back to 1.5 by the end of this century. And the question is, how do we come back? Well, the only reason why we come back is that, one, we stop emitting greenhouse gases from fossil fuel burning. Number two, we protect nature. So the oceans and all intact forests on land remain our best friends by sucking up roughly 50% of all carbon dioxide. So we stop emitting, but nature continues to cool. Three, we transition all food systems across the world from source to sink. They become a nature-based solution. And number four, that we actually do remove carbon from the atmosphere. So there is no safe landing, even at the best scenario we have today, without including carbon dioxide removal through different forms of carbon capture and storage and different forms of direct air capture. But they do not, and that's what I think Pope Francis is trying to emphasize, they do not allow, there's no science that allows us to replace fossil fuel emission reductions with carbon capture. So you cannot use them as an offsetting. You cannot excuse or greenwash or hide your fossil fuel emissions by investing in carbon dioxide removal. But science shows that, unfortunately, we have pushed ourselves so close to unmanageable conditions that we need to do everything right now. Get off fossil fuels, get the food system transition, save nature, and scale carbon dioxide removal. So it's not either or, it's all at the same time. And that is really challenging because the carbon dioxide removal technologies have to be used in ways that do not risk unexpected side effects. So we have to, and they have to be scaled equally soon as many of the other technologies.
Thank you, Dr. Rockstroms, for those insights. I just want to cite the IEA Net Zero emission report that came out last week, which is quite clear that carbon capture technologies is quite expensive and unreliable, and we should not even be looking at them. We should be making sure that we do not put carbon out there in the first place. And what is really important right now is that we do not put the fossil fuels, or we do not put carbon out there, and we ensure a just transition out of fossil fuels as the most and first important step. So thank you so much all for your insights. And I just want to say I'm genuinely humbled and deeply grateful to have this conversation with our esteemed panelists, generally sharing all their valuable insights with us today. And the audience has been very much engaged, asking all these very important questions that you all have been so careful to answer, and I'm so grateful that you have joined us. And before we close, I would like to invite Brother Dan to share with us a call to action. Brother Dan.
Thank you, Lin. It's important. Pope Francis reminds us that we're all called to ecological conversion. And this is something that he emphasized at the end of Laudato Si and reiterates again in Laudate Deum, saying especially that the need to realize that there are no lasting changes without cultural changes, without a maturing of lifestyles and convictions within societies, and there are no cultural changes without personal changes. And in that call to personal change, we invite you to visit the website laudatedeum.church to sign up as well at the Laudato Si movement website for more resources. We encourage you especially to read the full document, which is translated in multiple languages, to access the exhortation resources and to begin discussing this with those in your communities and take Pope Francis's call to action seriously, that we each can do something. We're all called to do our part.
Thank you so much, Brother Dan. As we close our time together, let us reflect on this musical version, which is a prayer for our earth from Laudato Si. Thank you all for coming, panelists. Thank you for our amazing audience and the questions that you asked. Laudato Si.
All-powerful God, filling all the universe and the smallest of your creatures, you embrace all life with tenderness. Oh yeah. Pour out the power of your love that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace that we may live as sisters and brothers. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you for being with us every day. Hey, hey. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you for being with us in every way. God of the poor, help us to rescue the lost and forgotten of this earth. So precious in your eyes, oh yeah. Bring healing to our lives and we'll protect the world from all this confusion. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the earth. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you for being with us every day. Hey, hey. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you for being with us in every way. Teach us, oh God, to discover the worth of each and everything, to be filled with awe and contemplation, oh yeah. To see we are united with every little thing as we journey to your light. Encourage us, we pray, to work for justice, peace, love, and understanding. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you for being with us every day. Hey, hey. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you for being with us in every way. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you for being with us every day. Hey, hey. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you. Whoa. We thank you for being with us in every